Welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all of the other people at the table. I'm DM Neal, aka Joke Maniac.
And I'm Dungeon Master Mitch.
And today we have a special episode. All of them are special. They warm my heart. But this one's a little bit more special because it is right around my birthday, which also means it's right around St. Patrick's Day. So we decided to bring on Scott and Forrest from the Astonishing Legends podcast to come blow our minds all about some Irish folklore. So we have 3 stories that we're going to go over, and they're going to, like I said, they're going to blow our minds, and we're going to see what we can take as inspiration for our homebrew worlds.
Speaking of, if you are a gold Patreon dragon or up, this week you can head over to our Patreon, and I have created some homebrew enchantments and curses for you, which will be a prevalent subject as we today look at the story of the Children of Lear.
But before we get to the meat, as always, we have some iTunes reviews. And up first, from Canada, America's Hat. And it makes us look good. This one is from Pressing F, and it's entitled The Best Thing for New DMs, 5 stars. I started listening in November of 2018. It's January 6th of 2019, and I've listened to over 100 episodes as a brand new DM. This is my go-to source for information and ideas. Loving the podcast. Keep being amazing. I promise that we will do that as long as you do the same. So thank you, Pressing F, for that review.
Yeah, thank you so much. And speaking of Canada, we have another review from there, from Halden. And Halden's review is entitled, Great Resource for a New DM, 5 stars. This podcast is a wonderful resource for new DMs. The DMing for Dummies episode is essential, in my opinion. That's a great point there. And I think that's what we say in our episode 0. A good place to start may not be episode 1 if this is your first time DMing. Check out DMing for Dummies. So thank you so much, Halden, for that review and for that bit of advice for any new-time listeners who are new-time listeners on episode 176. Hey, it's all good. It's all good.
Yep. But, Mitch, you know what time it is?
I do. It's time to go to that sweet special... Is it regular meat this week, or is it corned beef and cabbage? Ooh. I'm not sure, but either way, let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
So for this segment of the meat, we're joined by 2 guests. We're joined by Scott Philbrook and Forrest Burgess, host of the Astonishing Legends podcast. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us on. We're excited.
We're excited to have you guys and to talk this is what you guys do on your podcast all the time. We'll get more into that, but we're excited to talk some Irish folklore and myths with you today.
We love Ireland.
Well, it's got everything. These legends have everything in them. Giants, magic, adult men dressing as babies. It's got
everything you want from a good legend.
Perfect. So before we get to that, though, we have our interview segment where we have a couple questions. My personal favorite question is, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves that you think our listeners would be interested in? Because who knows what you're going to say next.
Okay. I'll go first for us, I guess.
Ahead.
I came to podcasting late in life. I was initially a television commercial editor for about 17 years and like a whole career in life and all that stuff. And then I had a kid and I stopped working because my wife made more than I did for a few years. And when I went back to work, I got into Forrest and I had the idea for this show. We had no idea if it would work. And at the time also didn't know if you could ever even generate 1 red cent from it. It was a blind bet.
Yeah, we needed a really expensive hobby to get into.
Yeah.
That we couldn't afford.
Yeah.
So we
and that also takes like 60 hours a week.
Yeah. Well, all that stuff we learned on the way. I also had a post-production video editing background, more with movie trailers to start off with, and then kind of industrial stuff, a lot of automotive industrial training videos and things like that. So we had the video background, but audio, interestingly enough, even though it's the audiovisual world, audio is its own thing. So we had to relearn a lot of stuff and learn a lot of new things. So that's been fun. but challenging.
Yeah, and I was so tired of editing. As soon as we were making any money, the first thing we did was I was like, we have to hire an editor.
Yeah,
So
as you guys well know, it's a lot of work, but anybody wanting to get into this, you can do it. It's a lot of fun. It's a huge joy of learning not only about this craft, but a bunch of new topics like we just did. Because we knew a little bit about Irish myths, but not until you dig into them do you really kind of get to the bottom of the stories. And, like learning the origin of Swan Lake, the opera, the ballet.
I know Neal has always referred to podcasting as a jobby, with the work of a job and the passion of a hobby.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That nails it pretty closely. And, it just, luckily for us, turned into a full-time thing. So we're pretty much doing that exclusively and trying to live life.
It's
in the balance.
It's a little less, I guess it's kind of nerdy, but like it is an entrepreneurial undertaking, really. And I remember that what they would say about entrepreneurs is people that will work 60 hours a week for themselves to avoid working 40 hours a week for someone else.
Yep.
It may be a little nerdy, but you're on the Dungeon Master's block today, so you're in the right place.
Excellent.
And speaking of podcasting, you guys have told us a little bit so far, but can you tell us, for any listeners who aren't familiar with Astonishing Legends, tell us a little bit about your podcast.
When we started the show, we had an interest, both Forrest and I, in the paranormal and unusual and UFOs and cryptids and all that kind of stuff. We felt that a lot of shows in the genre, the bulk of them really were kind of stuck in a presentation style that maybe needed updating and also needed to not take itself so seriously. But by the same token, we wanted to go deeper and ask the questions, because we both found ourselves, we're big fans of Unsolved Mysteries, and we're old enough to remember In Search Of as well. And then there's all the other little offshoot shows like Sightings and all those kind of shows. And we both used to watch those a lot. But there was always, because they were trapped by the format of television, there was always the time when they just couldn't ask the question. I mean, like, how could you go away from this interview without asking them, what the goblin in the garden was wearing?
Yeah.
Was it a blue, and so we wanted to go deeper on that stuff. So our show is a conversational style, co-hosted deep dive into the kinds of stories you would see on Unsolved Mysteries, and our topics vary as much as they did on that show. But we also, we get familiar, we get relaxed, we have guests on, we try to track down eyewitnesses whenever we can. And we just run the gamut all year long and do multi-parters and sometimes one-offs, and we talk too much. Right, Forrest?
As we've just seen, but I'm usually the one doing that. But it works out well because, that's the format without a show that we enjoy doing just as friends. Whenever we'd get together, we talk about strange and unusual things, and it's not just limited to the paranormal. There's just anything that interests us. So science, space, strange phenomena.
Laser beams, robots.
Yeah, just anything that we thought was interesting. And that's really the guiding point of the show, is that we will get on and talk about any unusual story that we come across or have heard of and that we personally want to know more about. So it's a little bit indulgent, but what we found is that there's a lot of other people out there like us who just have heard of something and want to know more about it.
Yeah, and who needs something to fall asleep to.
And there's the other crowd too. It's like they just find it very soothing. And so
That's fantastic. I think you guys have given us a really good a peek behind the curtain of podcasting. I know we had very similar origin story here of myself and the original co-host Chris. We just were like, we sit down and talk so much Dungeons and Dragons. Why don't we just put a mic in front of ourselves and see where this thing takes us? And it sounds like that's kind of where you guys started, and just the passion behind doing it.
Yeah,
true. So we have a surprise question that I made up myself, because a lot of the surprise questions that we get from our patrons often gear towards D&D, but I felt like that would be mean, so I came up with an even more difficult question, and I'm going to ask you that instead. So what are 2 episodes, and I'll pare it down a little bit, over the past year that you would kind of guide our listeners to get a really good feel for Astonishing Legends? I don't want to give you the whole catalog, because I know that would fry my brain if someone asked. So 2018.
Well, I mean, when people ask us, hey, I want to check out your show. What should I listen to? I think, the first thing that I say, look through the titles and find something that that just sounds interesting to you, or the, what our little description there, what kind of appeals to you, because again, we cover a wide gamut of topics, and stuff from the Old West. We don't do a whole lot of those, but it could be a historical angle. It could be something that's downright supernatural, like ghosts, UFOs. And so generally we'll say, like, yeah, take a look at the topic list and see which one grabs you, and just kind of gravitate towards that and check that one out first. But we just did a kind of a groundbreaking show for us about a very strange orb, a metallic orb that showed up on these people's property, and it moved on its own.
Yeah,
apparently.
it's weird because that is a series we just finished, but in a lot of ways it felt like a watershed series for us. And so it's multi-parts. You said 2 episodes. This particular one was 4 episodes, but it's about this thing called the Bet Sphere, which is, it sounds like, oh wow, it's a metal ball, big deal. But it's the story behind it is really crazy. And the other thing that was really interesting about this particular series was that the family that was involved have been unreachable for decades. And we managed to find one of the family members and get several hours of interviews with them and get all this insight that no one had gotten. And then on top of that, the family made it clear that after we were done, they weren't ever going to talk about it again. So that was kind of fun. Whoa. And then we got photos and X-rays and all this stuff that no one had ever seen. So that was kind of that was a big scoop for us. And I think prior to that, topic-wise, it's like Forrest says, it's a personal thing. So my personal answer to it was that we did a series towards the end of last year on the Sally House, which is a haunted house in Atchison, Kansas, that I had a personal experience at, the first one of my life that was paranormal. Nothing had ever happened to me when we started this series and until I went there. And the series, it was a little overindulgent. It's 4 parts and there's like 14 hours. So we did it for Halloween, and people expect us to get a little creepy at that time of year. This particular case though was one of those stories where when we started out, I said, "Oh, I hope that someday I'll experience something," and then something happened, and now I regret it. So that's kind of what that whole round was about. So I would say the Sally House and the Bet Sphere would be the 2 that I would pick, but that's hours and hours of commitment. So.
Well, those are the 2 most recent kind of big shows for us, and but like we said, it depends on what your interests lie, where they lie. What's interesting about the paranormal is that people they're very
it's compartmentalized
exactly
in terms of interest. Yeah.
Right. So, you'll hear this a lot when you talk about paranormal subjects. It's like, boy, I'm really into Sasquatch, but those ghost people, they're nuts. I don't believe anything about ghosts, but big hairy ape in the woods, like that's right up my alley. Or UFO people who are really into that don't believe in ghosts or Sasquatch. But what we found is that a lot of these things are connected. A lot of these subjects, in a weird way, seem to have tie-ins with each other. And so if you like creepy, we've got a few really scary series. I think the ones that stand out that people comment on the most are a series about the black-eyed kids, kind of a weird phenomenon of strange, creepy kids that show up at your door in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day. The other one that was also kind of a watershed one that we didn't really think was going to be, and that's also kind of a fun thing when we do a topic and we don't know where it takes us and we're not sure how it's going to be received, was shadow people. There's a lot of people out there that have this sleep paralysis, but it's not necessarily as you're going to sleep or waking up, where people see weird shadow beings near them.
Yeah, we're still getting a ton of email about that. And that one's actually several years old. So,
yeah, that's several years old. That was another Halloween show. But what we've learned is that, people would write to us and say, "I'm so glad you did this. I thought I was the only one. I thought it was nuts."
I was real excited about that one because that's the one that hooked us organically. Carrie Byron from Mythbusters. She started writing to us. Now we're like friends on Twitter. Awesome. That was it was pretty exciting.
Yeah, so that's a fascinating. There was something on Twitter just recently. You guys probably saw it where somebody put out a challenge of like draw the shadow people.
Oh, I did see that.
Yes. Visit you, and just it was a fascinating thread going through and seeing these drawings, and people got really into the descriptions of how these shadow people acted as well, which but I want to just totally back up your sentiment of like what's the best 2 episodes. You guys are saying it's going to be dependent. I know for me, I remember looking through your show list, and first of all, you guys are making lots of jokes about like, we won't do the reading and that. We'll take a couple notes, but like you don't have like a specific for most of them, they're series of we're
Yes.
looking at this topic, and you guys do a lot of the research, and it's you guys dive really deep. I just listened through your series, the tall ones, which I saw, and I was like, is this giants? I hope this is giants, and it was totally giants. You guys got into the biblical Nephilim and all, and it was it was very brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So
thank
for
you.
our listeners, like who love Dungeons and Dragons, love fantasy, love mythology, love legends, like I would encourage you head over, check this podcast out because you're going to be able to gain a lot of inspiration from a lot of these episodes.
Oh, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. It's what we found with Legends specifically, and maybe a lot of people don't realize it. Maybe they've learned it about it in school, but don't apply it to their daily life. It's like the things you read, the shows you watch, whether it's role-playing games or maybe like Game of Thrones. All of this mythology ties into ancient storytelling themes.
Yeah.
And if you find a lot of these cases, it's like people are still kind of weirdly experiencing some strange things in modern times. We just did a show on Gremlins, which, had its heyday in World War II, especially with British pilots of the RAF, and especially during the Battle of Britain. But what we found is that those sightings and those descriptions are of wee folk, of little people, of the ancient legends of the UK, of China, of every culture has their own strange beings, and you might think, well, these are just stories to entertain. Well, where do those stories come from? That's pretty imaginative.
Yeah, in fantasy writing, you always draw it back to Tolkien, right? Oh, like you can't get away from Tolkien. D&D is no exception. But Tolkien didn't just come up with that stuff either. Like he drew from all this inspiration on the Fae and all these stories of myth.
So I think you brought up a great way to look at reading stories and how to add them to your homebrew world in Dungeons and Dragons, because those stories happened for a reason. Those stories happened because of experience. So someone in your world interacted with a giant. Now it is a legend. Now it is a tale. It is myth. So speaking of giants, I said it because I know exactly which story we're going to talk about first. And that's Finn McCool and the Giant's Causeway. First off, I totally feel like this guy's wearing sunglasses in a convertible, but none of that happened. Hey.
It's the cool part.
Well, there's a bar here. There's a bar here in LA anyway.
Well,
a couple
there
of
you
them,
go.
Finn McCool. So,
yes.
Well, yeah, it's my understanding, and I have only a cursory knowledge of this, but that Finn was a giant, and he was having a disagreement with another giant, and he had trouble getting access across the water to reach this other giant. And I can't remember now, and also his original name, Finn McCool. The Celtic is Fionn Mac Cumhail.
If you were to read it, all the letters. But that's the great thing about the Gaelic language is that there's tons of letters you're never going to use or pronounce.
Yeah. So this was in Northern Ireland. But the thing about this that's interesting to me, and when you guys said, hey, we want to talk about this, and I went, as I said, doing some cursory research on it, and I saw the first picture of this road that he supposedly made to cross and battle this other giant, and I knew the pictures. I was like, oh yes, I know about this. And I didn't make all the connection because it's one of those things that there's still debate today over whether or not it is a naturally occurring formation or something more like the same thing they say about the Bimini Road, which is the one under the water that looks like it was man-made. But the hexagonal, so there's the big hexagonal tiles, but here's the thing that I thought was interesting about the story is supposedly Finn McCool threw them out to make them into a road, but they're so perfectly laid they look like Legos. So I was like, well, I was disappointed that he was throwing them. He must be amazing.
Yeah, these are well, right. That was he was gonna fight the Scottish giant Benandonner. And of course, whenever you have a battle of giants, some good story is going to come of it. And because they can hurl things like giant pieces of land.
Yes.
And it's a way, as you realize in folklore and mythology, of explaining geological features and things about the world that you don't really understand in those times because science hadn't been developed to explain it. Geology had not been understood in that way. So it's like, well, how do these really interesting geological features, these basalt stacks of rock that are hexagonal, but also with some with more sides. But I believe there's as tall as 30 feet tall, and
yeah, there's some towers. It looks a lot like the Fortress of Solitude, really.
Oh, yeah?
From the movie. Yeah. If you think about it, I don't know if there's any place where you can go and ask questions and Marlon Brando will pop up, but the but it is pretty amazing looking, and I mean that's as much as we know about the story. I think. What other, if there's other things you want to add, because you guys know more than we do.
Well, yeah, and I think that one of the great inspirations that can be drawn, you guys kind of talked about this already, is that like it's something that people saw this natural formation of land, but they couldn't comprehend, or possibly not natural, right? They couldn't comprehend how did this get made, and so this myth, this story came about where this giant had to get across to fight to teach that other giant from Scotland a lesson, because he was constantly hailing over insults to him. And so that's how this formation of land was created. And I think when we're creating our own worlds and our own stories, I think especially if you're thinking about giants, like that's a great place to go to for like, this is how it was made. But what I love about this story is I think the easier route is to go, oh, the giant was mad, and so they destroyed this, and that's how this crater was made, and like to get into the sheer power and destruction of the giant. But this is a story about a giant creating this land, and like, which is kind of flipping it on its head, but makes her a really great myth.
Right, and then I left out one of my favorite parts of the story is also that when he realized that Ben and Donner was either too big or too formidable,
like a sleeping mountain, I think most stories say.
Yeah, right. So then Ben and Donner comes over, and Finn's wife is like, "Quick, we're gonna dress you up like a baby." He's like, "What? What are you talking about?" She's like, "Trust me." So then they dress him up like a baby, and Ben and Donner gets over there and is like, "Oh my God, if the baby's this big, I got to get out of here." Yeah. And then he leaves. Right.
And not only does he see this quote unquote baby, but the wife feeds him cakes filled with rocks, which he bites into and is like, this is terrible. Why would you? And he's like, well, that's what my husband eats. Like, even the baby eats these. What are you upset about? Which chase this much bigger giant off. So that story of trickery, which, in talking about Dungeons and Dragons, what I love about this is that this is sometimes when we as DMs have players and we introduce these big monsters or these things that they have to defeat in order to continue on in the story, when you have regular friends sitting down at a table, quite often there's a story that one of them has, like, let's dress somebody up like a baby, that to you might seem ridiculous, but let's look at this real life myth story where that's literally what happens to turn that giant away, and it's fantastic.
It really is. Yeah. That element of that story, I feel like I've heard it creep up in other mythology too, not just the Finn McCool story, but let's pretend. And when we did our series, which you mentioned earlier on the tall ones and on giants and a lot of that mythology, one of the things that you found was that it was rooted just in the idea that these other cultures, that these particular branches of mankind were meeting were, only a little taller than they were. But they come back and they tell the story and they're like, they're huge, So it's really cool to think. But then by the same token, there is evidence of people that were literally giants, and there were all kinds of places where you found them buried. And so anyway, it's interesting, and it's a fun story to build on.
Well, the other thing that's really interesting, and I mean, I didn't do enough research to find it out, but part of the reason it's the Giant's Causeway is because this formation is on the coast of Ireland and on the coast of Scotland. Like that's kind of the key here as to why I think this myth formed. But I would be really interested to see if there is a Scottish myth that is similar or wildly different. And that, and that's just throwing that out there as another piece of going and trying to find more versions of a single myth, because depending on which ones we get to, that I listened to one several times and I'm just like, well, that's not what the last person said. And I'm like, well, that's not what the second person said. But then being able to dig deeper and find those different versions and, learn and gain more each time.
Yeah, there's different versions depending on what your culture is. So there's a Scottish version, which is similar, but of course, favors the Scottish giant Benandonner.
Oh, really? Did you find that
Well,
one?
I know there's a Manx folklore version where he's more of a shapeshifter, I believe.
Oh.
There's a Welsh version. So these things are passed down orally. And of course, it's like any other story. Over time, things are added, things are favored for the people who are listening to pump up those things that they're going to enjoy, as certainly any version of a movie that's released internationally sometimes now, especially for a Chinese audience. Things are tailored for their tastes and what they would prefer, so things are changed a little. But what's interesting about this is that, there are fantastical elements, but you're also describing, like in the case of the Giant's Causeway, in Scotland, there is a counterpart to these stacked rocks. What went in the middle? Well, it's Finn McCool heaving giant pieces of land towards Scotland and creating these stepping stones because he didn't want to get his feet wet. But then the giant, he learns, Benandonner, is coming to fight him, and he's so massive and much more formidable than he thought that now they are in a panic. And so Finn McCool's wife, Una, comes up with a plan, and that is to dress him up as a baby so that when he gets here, Benandonner gets there, she tells him, well, he's out for the moment, but he'll be back soon. In the meantime, please have some griddle cakes. And she either bakes them with rocks inside or actually iron griddles inside, and he chips a tooth. And then it's like, well, what are you, weak? And she shames him and says, well, look at the baby. The baby eats these. She encourages Benandonner to place his finger into the baby's mouth, and he gets bitten, just to see how sharp his teeth are. And that's what freaks Benandonner out. It's like, geez, this kid's got quite a bite. And if that's the baby, what's the dad look like? And he flees back across the stepping stones, across the Giant's Causeway, and destroys it on his way back, so that he cannot be chased by Finn McCool, who must be even larger than he is.
Well, here's the other thing about the Giant's Causeway. That's an environmental disaster. It's going to cause all kind of problems with the tides, and the sea life is not going to be able to get past it. So I think it's good to take it down.
Well, that's not. Yeah. Very, yes. Thanks for your geological.
It's like the Glen Canyon Dam. Yeah. No, Lake Powell's awesome, but it's bad for the Colorado River.
Yeah. So I think this is a great example of creating myths and legends in your world to be answers, whether they are true or not. And as you both pointed out, we all talked about, like, the fact that those legends might be different depending on what area you're going to, what people you're talking to. But I think it's a great example of creating myths and legends based on something in the world, some structure, whether it's natural or clearly not natural, and having these stories that people can tell on how they were formed in the first place. But let's kind of transition now into the next story that we want to talk about, the next myth, which is the Children of Lear, which I think is probably one of the most common stories that we hear from Irish mythology. I think you don't have to be too familiar with with Celtic mythology to have heard of at least King Lear and the Children of Lear.
Well, this is a classic tale of Irish mythology, but it has the things that we look at and we do on our show. It's like, where do these things start? What's the themes of these stories? What's the purpose? And this is it's a tale from just after the arrival of Christianity, but it also has a lot of Druid themes in that there's Druid magic and Druid wands, and it's a mix of magical elements, but also human tales, I guess, dealing with, like with family values. And it's treachery, it's lying, there's murder involved. It's all the human things, but rooted in tales of essentially the gods or supernatural people and how they deal with it. And a lot of times, as we find in mythology, they're worse than a lot of humans we know. But it's a way to also bridge the gap between these pagan gods and the emergence of Christianity. So the basic idea about, especially this story, the Children of Lear, the children of the tragic story of the Children of Lear, or the fate of the Children of Lear, is that you can have your pagan beliefs and your stories, but come to Christianity because it's really going to do something for you. It's going to better your life, and that is the moral to this story ultimately.
So, I feel like that was an amazing way to start looking at the Children of Lear, but like this is the one that tripped me out the most with like trying to get quick synopsis of the story and listening to different videos and other people's take on it, some of which was in Gaelic and I didn't understand anything. So I'm like, well, I'm not here to read, I'm here to listen. And I turned it off and pulled up another video. But the different takes on it. So essentially King Lear loses his wife. In some versions, he feels that the children need a mother. In some versions, I heard it's because he's lonely. So either way, he gets a new wife. New wife is not a fan of the children. She seeks out some druids. She gets a wand. She says, hey, let's go to the lake. Boom, you're all swans now. And in one version, she goes back and tells Lear that they drowned and they passed away, and he goes to the lake. And in one version, it was just sad. Another, it was more sad, where he could hear the children speaking to him as the swans, and then he just passed away in old age because there was nothing he could do. But they were destined to be swans for 900 years. But it's okay. Don't worry, though. They got to travel once every 300 years to a new location.
To a new lake, right?
And if they would hear a church bell was one way it was said, and another, I think, more apt would be that if they heard the ring of a Christian bell, they would be set free. And eventually they...
Yeah, which goes back to what
exactly,
Forrest was saying.
and they eventually set free, and I was like, oh, I wonder. Oh no, they immediately turned into old people, grabbed each other's hands, and died, and then went to heaven, as it were. And there was, I mean, Forrest, I appreciate all the information you gave, because I'm gonna be honest with you, I did not know what I was supposed to take away from that initially. Like, I was just like,
what is the point of
this really bummed me out, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do next.
That's a lot of death and spells, and it's a good thing you're immortal, but also that's a curse, which people don't realize. That, oh, wouldn't it be great to live for hundreds of years? Yeah, but you're a swan. Yeah. And the swan's misery was the cold weather, because they would have to travel up north, I believe, at some point after a certain period of time.
Yeah, at one point they got stuck in the ice.
It was, right? The weather was so terrible. And if you've ever been to the northern UK Isles in Scotland and Ireland, that weather is really harsh up there, and that it's also a way of tying that to the people who live there, because they realize, like, yeah, it can get nasty up here, and imagine suffering that kind of cold where the water freezes one winter and your feet are stuck, and that's when they cry out to the King of the Heavens, like, please help us. And in the story, it's like, well, guess what? They get helped. And that's why you should convert to Christianity.
But their help was to turn instantly 900 years old and die a few minutes later.
That is one version,
Which, after that long of a time being a swan in those,
that's probably
that type
feels
of environment,
pretty good.
That might be the best thing that's happened. Yeah.
And then they said that the man at the church saw 4 swans flying through the sky. And I was like, man, how bummed are they? They're like, we're humans again. No, we're swans again.
One of the things that I loved about this story was when King Lear finds out that this has happened to his children, he makes a law all across his kingdom that no one can kill a swan. And that's because he's like, I don't want someone to mistake one of my children and kill them, and then one of my kids be dead. I mean, and honestly, if you were out and you're about hunting, and I mean, you're probably looking for like a deer, or maybe you're looking for a goose, but then a swan talks to you, you might shoot that thing just out of sheer like, what is going on? Kill the demon swan, take it down. So at least put a law over the land. And for those of us like who, we just had an episode a couple back where we talked about talking animals in a fantasy world. Obviously, you can go to the Chronicles of Narnia and see that that's a huge theme in that. But for this story, it's people who have been enchanted as animals. And if you're running a world where there are talking beasts, perhaps that's a way that those animals, that's the reason they're talking, that they were once people that were cursed. And then as Forrest, you're bringing up the point of the story is, you have that ring of the Christian bell being their salvation. Well, maybe there's only 1 or 2 ways that you can break this curse, and it has to be of some divine origin.
Yeah, that's the solution to your misery. But you just brought up a really fascinating angle here that I think gamers would love, because it's you can use it as a great tool in any story or game, and that's shape-shifting. Like you said, it's transmogrifying between one form and another, which gives you various powers. We just this is a while back, but we did a whole episode, which this is another game changer for Scott that it freaked him out. Was we did an episode on Skinwalker Ranch.
Oh yeah.
Another interesting tie-in is that these Native American legends, especially around this would be northern Utah, have their own shape-shifting legends, which they still are respectful of. They don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Outside, they don't talk about it to each other, because that might bring on a skinwalker. And we're talking now about, especially with the Native American versions of, again, somebody being kind of cursed or bringing on a curse onto themselves for black magic.
Yeah, so
And-
starting out dabbling in dark magic and then getting caught up in it. It's a real Darth Vader situation, but instead of that, you're one of your chosen forms is giant canine or half canine, half human.
Yeah,
that wears a checkered shirt and likes to smoke cigarettes.
Well, that's one
It's
version.
it's a crazy story.
That's one version. But it's something, yeah, again, it goes back to all this mythology. There are curses, like the one daughter cursing the stepmother for trying to drown them, and having, and saying like, well, you were going to pay for this. And
Well, initially she was going to kill them, and she drew a sword, but then she lost her nerve.
yeah, she was going to have her henchmen do the dirty work, and then she was going to do it herself, and couldn't bring herself to it. But just for that act, she was cursed. And getting back to the skinwalkers, that's usually a shaman who usually commits a horrible act against the tribe or their nation, and that turns you to the dark side, essentially. But you are granted these powers of incredible speed.
And
Sometimes it's not always a wolf-like character, but you could be a bear in some cases, or an eagle, some kind of flying creature. And so there's a lot of themes, because we're all people, no matter where you live, of seeing animals and having wanting their specific capabilities, but also that comes at a price, and that you can be trapped like that. And so, but the shape-shifting thing that's fascinating to us, only because, again, there are current modern day stories of people seeing weird half human werewolf-like type creatures running alongside their car.
There's a lot more of those stories than one would think. Even in modern times. Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, even like you're bringing up different types. Like, what if the curse was even something where you weren't a swan always? A new year comes and then you turn into some other type of creature, a rabbit, or the king, the person who's looking out for you, has made this law: do not kill swans. It's gonna be a lot more harder to keep you safe if you're constantly changing, and the laws of the land are constantly changing. And especially if you're an outsider coming into a kingdom, and you walk in and you see this sign, right? This big poster that says no rats are allowed to be killed this year of our king. And maybe you see like that poster being ripped down and a new one being put up because the year has changed. It's a new year, and it's like, now the rats, you can kill rats, but please don't kill any turkeys, because
right.
Yeah. Well, there are common elements with all mythology here that we see, and I'm sure it's reflected in in our literature and games that we play, that things about a supernatural lure, like the swan song was so alluring, it calmed people and was beautiful to hear. Or we hear about, in people that ride in, it's just like, I had this, and I know this sounds crazy, but people will say, I felt this draw to follow this thing into the woods when they see a strange creature, whether it's a pukwudgie or, wherever you are, there's something trying to lure you in. It could be a leprechaun, it could be a brownie or a sprite. In the UK, you might have something that wants to bring you to their world from which you may never return. So it's alluring, but there's danger. And, these are common themes, again, that keep coming up and again. We see it in Greek mythology. You'll see it in Asian mythology. It's always kind of the same thing because these are also cautionary tales in a weird way, like with Greek mythology, not to behave like these supernatural beings. I remember a classics professor I had back in college saying, you look at these heroes from these legends, and they sound great. They can do tremendous feats and with tremendous strength, and they have wisdom, but also they're doomed in a way. That's that old saying, all the heroes we know are dead. They're also not the nicest people a lot of times. They'll commit atrocities of their own and have to pay for them. So that's another purpose of these stories, is that they are a morality tale and a tale of caution to live your life better. Don't do what these guys did.
So while we could definitely talk Irish mythology probably until we die or 900 years later when we hear the ring of a Christian bell, but the question I have for everyone, and I'll answer it first, is what are some further readings or topics that we could send people to kind of like get more? So for me, it's someone we've kind of had connection to through the podcast, but it's Jim Zub, and he wrote a comic book series. It's only 30 issues, and it closes out, and it's called Wayward. And it delves really deep into both Japanese mythology as well as combining it with a lot of Irish mythology as well. So it's a great way to be able to dip in both, and it heavily focuses on Druidic kind of mythology when it dips into Irish, but also merges the two, which I think is a great example of what you might want to do in your homebrew world for your game, because you may have something, but you want it to be more. So it's a great way to look at these kids that are becoming essentially the new gods, and one character is half Japanese, half Irish. And so then that's where that connection comes through.
Wow.
So that's Wayward by Jim Zub.
So last year we did a series, I think it was last year, wasn't more than a year ago, called The Tall Ones, which you talked about earlier. And that was a multi-part series on giants, which was another one. We often get into these things where Forrest is like, hey, let's do this. And then I'm like, my God, this topic is, I mean, it's huge, like a giant. It kept unfolding. And there was a lot of stuff that we researched for that, and some that actually didn't make it into the show. I was looking back through our notes for that episode, and one was the Fomorians. Have you guys heard of those?
Actually, weird that you bring that up.
They're
D&D monster.
It already is.
Yep.
Well, there you go.
Is,
that's what I was going to say. Is the research on them was pretty fascinating. And a lot of the images and everything about them, I thought was personifications of chaos, darkness, death, blight, and drought. It's pretty amazing. So. All right, so basically that shows how much I know about D&D. I just basically gave you. It's probably like the most primary character.
It certainly isn't. It certainly isn't. But I think that's a great point, like which we've brought up at the beginning of the show is, and honestly, I knew it was a D&D monster. I didn't know anything about the origins of that monster as a giant, and I think that's a great point to look at the origins of these monsters and these creatures and check out the myths, and some of them are going to be completely different. I mean, if you look at a troll in D&D and you look at a troll as when you look back at like Norwegian trolls and mythology, it's so different, and you can change that up for your own world and come up with some great stories. My last bit of homework is I'm going to say, listen, if you're listening to the show, then you are probably a big fan of podcasts. So go check out some podcasts that talk about myths, talk about legends. Start with Astonishing Legends because they have a lot and it's really great and they dive in deep. But yeah, there's so much out there that you can listen to and just take inspiration from all of these stories from cultures in our real world and put it into your homebrew world.
We do have, and I don't know if you guys know. Do you guys know a guy named Fiddleback?
Yeah. On Twitter.
Yeah, he has a show called GM Word of the Week.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think people would like that. And some of his other shows, it's a podcast for tabletop gamers and word nerds. That one. But anyway, a pretty cool guy, and a lot of his topics would cross over with what you guys cover.
Perfect. So I have the most important question though. Where can people go on the internet to find all that you do?
Astonishing Legends can be found pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify now, Pandora maybe, and then Himalaya, which is a new player. It's pretty cool. You can find us there as well. I actually prefer it to the Apple Podcasts app.
Yeah.
And then
And we have our own website, astonishinglegends.com, all spelled out. And there you'll find a lot of our show notes, links to articles we used for research.
Lots of
photos.
pictures.
Yeah, photos, anything connected to that episode of the show. And there is one web page for every episode that we do, even for the whole series. You'll find new and different things that you can dive down that rabbit hole if you
and
choose.
links to books as well. If you,
Yeah.
there's a bookstore situation for all those the topics that we've covered. So
Perfect.
Yeah.
So definitely check out Astonishing Legends, and Scott and Forrest.
Yes.
Thank you guys for joining us on this episode of
hey,
the Dungeon
thank you
Masterblock.
guys so much for inviting us on. It was a blast. Really appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much.
And with that, let's head over to the mailbag of holding.
But they have been asking for their mail on a daily basis. It's all they're talking about up there.
That
Gary.
right there is the mail. Now let's talk about the mail. Can we talk about the mail, please, Mac? I'm dying to talk about the mail with you all day, okay?
Today in the mailbag of holding, where we talk about ideas, stories, and questions that you, the listener, have, we have a question from DM Just Jeff. And they emailed us and they had a couple questions about one, what are some tips that we might have for improvisation? You know, when your players zig when you thought they would zag, and also kind of falling back into either character voices or just in character at all. So those are the two questions we have right now.
With the first part of that question kind of being rattled when players do something with their characters that you're not expecting, that you don't have notes on, that you maybe takes you completely off a path that you were going, or even they were going, so it just throws you off. I think first off, I think it's good to recognize that this happens to every GM out there, and maybe us DMs who run games at home, we're starting to feel like that's not the case, because we have so many well-produced, amazing actual plays out there. But I would say 99% of those are highly edited so that you don't have to worry about moments where you're like, I don't know, as the DM.
Yep.
Because that's not going to make good showtime, right? But it happens to all of us as DMs. So first of all, kind of don't worry about that. And I think improv, the more and more you do it, the better you will get at it. And I also think that it's okay to every now and then be like, wow, guys, you really threw me for a loop. Let's take a 5-minute snack break, refill your drinks, give me a second, because you really, this is really cool, the idea that you're throwing out here, but I'm going to need a second to prepare for it. The players can't expect you to have everything prepared for everything that they throw at you. Neil, what are your thoughts?
Definitely. That's what I was going to say. One, don't beat yourself up about it. Two, definitely be willing to take that break and be honest. I mean, your players are going to know that there needs to be breaks and thought process and things like that. And the other thing would be to potentially have some things already in your pocket, you know, and so then small things that you've created that you could pull out basically out of a hat whenever you need them. And that kind of leads into having some NPCs that you've already built, and what do they sound like, what do they act like, and having them possibly on note cards so that they're ready whenever you need them.
Yeah, and I think once again, I know I do it all the time. I lose my accent. My accent changes for a NPC. I think it happens to every DM out there who's trying to do voices. And I would say don't be discouraged and stop doing voices. I know as a DM, I often have to kind of give my players a little nudge and be like, hey, in your character voice, please. Let's get into the role playing. I think it's okay to have your players also know that they can do that to you as a DM and be like, whoa, you're not doing the accent. Please do the accent for us. That's what we love to hear. And to be able to laugh at yourself when you know that you're not doing a great job and you're falling out of the accent, or it's just an accent that you maybe need a little bit more practice at, or never going to get quite down. But that's the whole point of role playing, is having fun. So just don't let it be at that point where you're not having fun with it.
Yep, and a quick tip that I think is out there on the internet, but a thing you can also do, and I know I do it some, is have some sort of primer I think is the official term. If it's not, well, then I sound stupid. But basically, either a saying or a single word that gets you into the voice. You know, and so like if I know I'm going to do a pirate voice, I know unfortunately I need to end up saying yar a lot to like bring me into that voice and that accent. And that could even just be part of the character, is that the character says yar a lot, and now you're in your pirate voice every time you do kind of that tick for that character. But thank you, DM Just Jeff, for writing in with those awesome questions.
So we want to thank both Scott and Forrest for joining us on the show today and helping us to look at some of these Irish myths and just gaining all this inspiration. And I think this is a really good example of how you can look at real world mythology and just really soak up some ideas and some inspiration for your homebrew fantasy worlds. Neal, if our listeners would like to get in touch with us, maybe they have based some of their homebrew world and the stories and campaigns that they've played from some real world mythology. If they'd like to get in touch with us and tell us a little bit about that, where can they reach us at?
They can always email at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. And of course, you can always head on over to iTunes, help get our name out there, and give us a 5-star review if you see fit. And of course, we will read it on air.
You can follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock. And you can like our Facebook page. Both of those places are great places to go if you want updates about the show, memes, and just all around D&D goodness.
As always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network, where you can check out other amazing shows like Dungeons, Dragons, and Daughters, Detentions and Dragons, the GM Showcase, and more.
And that's it for this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
killing characters,
and lowering the egos of all their people at the table.
I'm DM Neal. Good night, and good luck of the Irish.
I'm Dungeon Master Mitch. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and keep on dungeon mastering.
Welcome back to the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the eagles.
Lowering the eagles! It's back!
The
second time it's happened.
Yes.
And Halden's review is entitled Great Resource for a New DM, 5 stars. This podcast is a wonderful resource. Resource? What is resource? This
I need to go research some eagles. No, they taken me Lucky Charms.
Goodbye.